Keith du Plessis and his wife Shelley serve on the Apostolic Council for Church of the Nations and have led the Issachar cluster since April of 2012. The Issachar cluster comprises of churches in South Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Since 1982, Keith and Shelley have pastored 2 denominational churches and served on the pastoral team of Harvest Christian Church for 11 years. From 1988 to 1995, Keith was in charge of religious broadcasting on Radio South Africa, part of the national network of radio stations under the banner of the SABC. Keith and Shelley derive their greatest delight and fulfillment in helping Christians understand the power of being correctly aligned, discovering their redemptive purpose and call in God, and then living it out daily. Their passion is to see and help local churches become and remain relevant to the times in which they live. Keith and Shelley have 2 beautiful daughters and 1 son-in-law, and Keith says that he's really looking forward to being a grandfather. Keith has an outgoing personality and has always been a people person. He has supported the Arsenal Football Club since he played football as a child, and although he no longer participates in rugby and the 100 and 200 meter sprints, he continues to enjoy watching them. He is also an avid reader, especially keeping abreast of world events. He also enjoys following news programs and political commentary. Here's a surprising fun fact about Keith that many don't know. Keith enjoys a wide range of food interests, some of his favorites being a good curry and apple crumble. Please welcome Keith du Plessis.
I almost expect Elvis Presley to walk in from the right-hand side with an introduction like that. Yeah, it's a very real privilege for me to open this morning's session with the Word, and so appreciate what John had to say. And just a delight. One of my greatest delights is to open the Word, to expound the Word, and to be able to share what I have learned over the years and the training and the skill that God has given me in interpreting the Word. And I trust that this morning that will be of benefit to all of us. Part of the challenge of coming in this late in the conference is that you've either heard God and you're backing on to what everybody else has said, or you're a Lone Star Ranger out there. In some measure, I fit both camps this morning. I can honestly say that from the moment Louis started speaking, like Mark said yesterday, I thought, there goes my message. But I can also say that banking on that and building on that, what God has given me, is to take it in a different direction. And I sense that God wants us to hear that today as well. A few weeks ago, I sat with a young pastor who said to me, "Can you tell me how it is that I and my church really build the kingdom in our community? What do we do that makes us know that we're building the kingdom?" And I'm not sure whether I was more surprised by what I instantly said or by what God dropped into my heart. Because actually what came out of my heart was not a 1, 2, 3 plan of action, which is my normal bent. But what came out of my mouth was just this statement: whatever He tells you to do, do it. Whatever He tells you to do it. And I thought I'd better go and check and see what I'd actually said and the context. And I knew that it was in the context of the wedding feast of Cana. But as I went and started to read up on that story, the fascination with this story and its context and its place in Scripture began to take me on a journey over the next couple of weeks, where I began to read into the story. And I want to just share some of those insights with you this morning, building on this thing. Whatever He tells you to do it. I went and I read and I reread this passage. And what I discovered, first of all, was not only was this in the context of the wedding feast of Cana of Galilee, but I discovered that John is the only one of the 4 gospel writers to record this miracle. So it's a one-off. Not only did I discover that it was John who wrote this particular miracle and recorded it, but John anchors this particular miracle as the first public display of Jesus. And if you know the way that John writes the gospel that he writes, he differs from Matthew, Mark, and Luke in this: that he is less worried about the historical facts as he is about putting Jesus at the center of everything. So all of the historical data, all of the things that John writes about have one purpose and one purpose in mind, exalting Jesus. So when we go to Mark and when we go to Luke and when we go to Matthew, we have some accurate historical data to work with. Where John includes some of those things, we understand this, that he's tying those things to prove to us that Jesus was someone different, that Jesus is the King. So if you take those things together, then you begin to realize that the placing of this particular story in John chapter 2 as the face of Jesus declaring the kingdom of God in a way in which people could tangibly understand, and in the package of the miracle that he uses, as opposed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who have as their first miracle the healing of people or the healing of a demoniac, then you begin to understand that there is something very significant about the way that John has recorded this message and where he has placed it. And if that is true, then we dare not take this thing lightly, and we need to begin to read into this story what was Jesus trying to lay down as some basic guidelines for his understanding of the kingdom, because that's what John was trying to say. There's some things in this passage, in this ordinary story of water being turned into wine, that if we only reduce it to the level of a miracle, we lose. And I want to share with you this morning 4 things that I believe God showed me in this particular passage about what Jesus was demonstrating in the simplicity of turning water into wine in the context of a marriage feast. The first thing that I want to say to you is this, that what I believe Jesus was teaching was this lesson, that number one, seeing only the obvious can blind us to the real. Seeing only the obvious need can blind us to the real need. See, I grew up in a context that celebrated the miracle. We had some moral issues because we weren't 100% sure whether it was grape juice or wine that it was turned into. But once we got past that, all of my tradition taught me about celebrate the miracle, celebrate the miracle, celebrate the miracle. But when you read this passage, you begin to understand that the kingdom is much more than just words or just principles. The kingdom always needs a context within which to operate. So if you go back to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what you'll find is that Jesus makes a proclamation of some degree or another about the kingdom being here. Then there's a gap, and then there's a miracle. John doesn't even do that. He simply goes straight in, and he says, here we declare this is the Jesus, and we put him into the context of a marriage feast where he turns water into wine. There's no healing of a man. There's no healing of a demoniac. There's no kind of big razzmatazz. It's in the ordinariness of life and the normality of life, in the rhythm of life, where there is simply a wedding feast that is taking place, that John anchors the declaration, this is the King. Now, at first, that may not strike you as being very significant, but as I thought about this, I began to understand something about what John was trying to say. We can so easily be distracted by the fact that the kingdom comes when we see the razzmatazz, when we see the big, when we see the operation at a large scale, that we can miss the very nature of what the kingdom is for most of us, which is lived out in the ordinary rhythms of day-to-day life. It's rare that we see the big healings. It's rare that we see the big deliverances of people. It's much more likely that we're going to be in weddings. It's much more likely that we're going to be touching the normality of life, is it not? And I think that John was trying to say this to us first and foremost, that we might be looking for something that gives us evidence that God is using us in building the kingdom and miss the many, many opportunities that God is saying in the ordinariness of life, this is where my kingdom is built. And if we reduce it simply to the miracle of the water into wine, we miss the backlighting, the context of what was going on here. So I had to ask myself the question, and Tony's helped me understand this because he reiterates this thing. He said, the only thing better than needing a miracle is not needing it in the first place. In dealing with the issues that cause somebody to need a miracle for a breakthrough. And that's the evidence of the kingdom, isn't it? When we're living in a place where the principles of the kingdom are living themselves out in such a way that we don't need constant miracles to get us out of trouble or get us out of a situation. So here's a wedding. Last year, we married off my eldest daughter, and I know the meticulous planning that went into it. Louis and Edna are still recovering from the one that they had just a month ago. Exactly. That's why he's so quiet in this conference, because he's still recovering. There is meticulous planning. It's planned down like a military operation to the last degree. So doesn't it strike you as odd that in the context of a marriage where everything would have been planned, something goes wrong, not even towards the end of the marriage, because remember, most Jewish marriages took a week, 7 days. We're now into day 3. We've got more left at the end than we've had at the start. And they run out of wine. Doesn't it strike you as odd that there's something in the ordinariness of this particular situation that has gone wrong? There's a crisis. There is a crisis. And most of us, in the way that we live our lives, and we can argue from leadership theory and all sorts of things, we don't have to concentrate on the urgent. We must always concentrate on the important. The reality is that the urgent will always win over the important. Not so. Because when you're faced with a crisis, that's what you're going to deal with. And when we read the story, Jesus turning the water into wine would appear that all he is responsive to is the crisis. Until we begin to read something of the backlight behind the story to understand that Jesus, while dealing with the crisis, the urgent, never took his eye off the important. So what are we talking about here? This wedding may have been served by sufficient wine being made available by Jesus' intervention, but the underlying need lay in the societal structures and the norms which were being tolerated. The very best of the conservative commentators that I have consulted on this, because I don't just trust my own insights in this, men of God who have written commentaries over many, many years and who I thought would concentrate on the morality of do you drink wine or don't you drink wine, because that's the kind of culture that they come out of, shocked me when I started to read their commentaries on this particular miracle, because one after the other, after the other, after the other, just skipped past the dynamics of the miracle and went to the societal undertones that underpinned the society and began to talk about why it was that the wine had run out. And they suggest, as a common denominator, that the fact that they ran out of wine proves that the couple that were being married came from a poor background. They could not afford to be able to buy sufficient stocks of wine to be able to cover the 7 days. And their hope had been that as the guys drank the wine, they would have become more and more and more happy and less and less dependent on wine, so that by the time they got to the end of the thing, they would have been actually content to drink water and not known the difference. Sounds bizarre to talk about that in a church conference, isn't it? That we're kind of talking about drunkenness, but that's the kind of thing that was in the heart of this young couple who said, we're just hoping against hope, because our budget could only stretch this far, that's how far it's going to go. The fact that they ran out of wine is not about bad planning, but it's about a fiscal scene. And why was this so important to Jesus? Why was he reading this as the subtext of what was going on? Why was it that he said to his mother, woman, my time has not yet come. Don't come and ask me to do this kind of thing. Yet he relents and he does it. It's because he reads behind this. This is the problem. Because the only way out for this young couple would have been to get themselves into debt in order to cover what society demanded. Because you see, weddings, it started out fairly natural, but one began to outdo the other, began to outdo the other, began to outdo the other, and so the tone of weddings got higher and higher, and as they got higher and higher, the expectations got higher and higher. So pity if you were number 10, you were 10 times more prejudiced in what you had to provide for the society that in the name of celebration had become a very demanding society. And Jesus understood this, that if this young couple got themselves into debt, instead of starting debt-free so that what they could put together and start their married life in terms of how the scriptures wanted them to do so, they would forever be under debt from day one and could never get out of it. Or they would have opted to say, we cannot get into debt, Society toughies, this is the problem. We've run out of wine, you've now got to drink water. And the very society that was celebrating their love would have become a punitive society and would have ostracized them, and they would forever be known, together with their family, couldn't provide. Isn't it amazing how societies that we work in, the very societies that should celebrate the things, the milestones that we get to in our lives, can very easily become just as much a punitive society and ostracize people. And Jesus takes compassion on this young couple and he begins to say, I'm not going to let them start off like this. I'm not going to give in to the pressures of this society simply because that's what society wants. He wasn't a chaplain of consumerism, as one of the writers that I've been reading recently said. Jesus wasn't pandering to their consumerism. He was concerned for the lowest of the lowest, the couple that should have been the focus of attention in this wedding. He was underscoring the value of love, underscoring the value of a couple that was saying to that very society, our declaration of love to each other this morning is making your society stronger because we're doing it within the boundaries of love. Jesus says, I'm honoring that. That's the backlight to this particular story. That's what I'm trying to do. And if we just read this as being a simple miracle, turning water into wine, how profound that miracle might be, we lose so much of what John was trying to get to when he said, by implication, this is why Jesus responded. I wonder sometimes how much I miss in the ordinariness of my life, the day-to-day routines of my life, how many opportunities to simply represent Jesus, to be the extension of his love, to be the one who simply is responsive in my obedience to what he tells me to do because I'm looking for something bigger, something more razzmatazz, to qualify as the king, qualify as the kingdom. Beware that we don't just see the obvious and miss the real need. Number two, I believe that John teaches us in this passage that the kingdom operates not by imposition, but by persuasion. Not by imposition, but by persuasion. Or to put it in other terms, that we need to operate in authority rather than power. We need to operate in authority rather than power. Max Weber is a sociologist, was a sociologist. And Max Weber defines power and authority this way. He said, you have power when people have no option but to follow you because you've got some kind of role over them. Authority is when, despite what people might think, they do follow you because they want to follow you. I grew up in a time in my country where, because of the very cozy relationship between church and state, church was protected. The gospel was protected. And we had a Christian country. So our policy of education, for instance, in our country was known as Christian national education. And wherever you looked, everything was Christian, Christian, Christian. We had freedom to worship. We had freedom to proclaim. We had freedom to preach. I went to a government school, but every single morning, the entire school population was gathered together in the school hall for what we called assembly, and it was always started by a Bible reading and prayer that the headmaster used to lead. We used to sing a hymn, and then the Jewish boys used to come in from the outside because they were exempt. But everybody else, didn't matter what your particular persuasion was, you were subject to that. And so Christianity in my country, because of its favored state, through its legal system, through the government that was in power at the time, imposed a Christian worldview on a population whether they wanted it or not. And we operated under the power of a Christian commitment, but it didn't necessarily take us to a place of authority. We didn't carry authority. And in this particular miracle, Jesus doesn't default to the power. I'm constantly astonished at how low-key, relative to a healing of a man, a healing of a demoniac, another healing of a man, as the startup point for the other synoptic gospel writers. I'm constantly amazed at how low-key this actually is. Yeah, it's a miracle. Water turns into wine. But it's not as dramatic, is it, as somebody having been delivered in the front of a whole crowd or people being healed. I'm constantly amazed at this whole low-key nature of Jesus' involvement. Actually, it's not a good start if you're trying to build a reputation. Because there's a handful of servants, a few guys that say, we want to be your disciples, but we're still in two minds about this, and your mother. They're the only people that know that Jesus is responsible for making sure that the better quality wine is served. Even the MC doesn't know that Jesus was responsible for it. All he knows is that the servants are bringing a better quality of wine. There's no sinner's prayer. There's no, well, these are the keys of the kingdom right here. And Jesus slinks off. Just slinks off. But he leaves a deposit of the kingdom amongst 20 people who witnessed it with their own eyes and saw in that moment there's something different about this guy. In fact, if you read the end of this passage in John chapter 2, recording the wedding feast at Cana, it simply says this in verse 11. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee. He manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Not much stuff to go on in terms of building your reputation or claiming, wow, the kingdom has come. It's much easier when there's demoniacs being delivered and people being healed and all sorts of things, isn't it? So I take refuge in John because what I find is that so much of what John talks about is so much more of what I touch on a daily basis. The ordinariness, the low-keyness. And Jesus doesn't regard the fact that he didn't get this big gathering, or I'm not even sure that the young couple whose bacon he saved were even aware of the fact that they'd been saved. And if they were, maybe they thought some kind benefactor had bailed them out, or dad-in-law had gone and hocked his house to get them some money to pay for this. There was no direct correlation between what had happened and the person that was involved. But Jesus is content that the kingdom has come because it saved a young couple. But more importantly, those who said they believed in him were now grounded in him. And they will be the ones that would go on and expand this kingdom. See, sometimes we get drifted away here. Sometimes we get distracted because we feel like unless our brand is attached to it, we actually haven't accomplished the kingdom. Sometimes we want it to be up in lights. Sometimes we so want Christ to be attached to it. Back home, we have an organization. It's an Islamic organization called Gift of the Givers. That Gift of the Givers is a well-oiled machine that is one of the first aid agencies that will arrive in any country where there has been a disaster. Within 24 hours of any disaster anywhere in the world, their containers are on their way, their front-end guys are up front. And I've often thought to myself, why aren't the Christians there? Because it's quite clear that this is an Islamic agency. And I think to myself, Jesus did it differently. Turned it upside down. He wasn't trying to build a brand, he was trying to build a kingdom. The kingdom operates not by imposing our will or our way, not by resorting to power, but by living in a place of authority. For someone who could gain capital out of the publicity that could come from this miracle, Jesus seems remarkably reluctant to impose his will and way on the situation. He says to his mother, this is not the time. My time is still going to come. My time is still going to come, and then everyone will know. The wonderful thing about this is that Jesus is quite content to share it around, and he says to those servants, fill those jars with water. And in their responsive obedience, the miracle takes place and the kingdom comes. Kingdom operates not by imposing our will, but by persuasion through our deeds. Number 3, we're called to build his kingdom, not our empire. That word has come through a number of times. I'm glad I wrote my notes up before I started hearing all these things, so I'm simply reiterating. It was a word that I felt God gave me. Our calling is to build his kingdom, not our empire. I want to make this statement this morning. John's sole purpose in recording this miracle was to say this, that without the centrality of a king, all you can build is an empire. You cannot build a kingdom without a king. And when I grow up in in my self-importance, or when I grow up and I've kind of got a legacy or a track record of things that I think have built the kingdom, it's a very easy move for me to be able to say, look how much I've influenced, and my brand or my empire gets built instead of his kingdom. Jesus knew that everything that he was going to do was going to be in the light of his kingdom mandate. His time would come some 3 years later on Calvary, when his name would be made public. It would be on people's lips, not as the miracle worker, but it would be on their lips with derision. That's the counterside to the kingdom, isn't it? We like to have our names on people's lips. We like to be in a place of saying, this is successful. Jesus said, my hour has come. When people recognized him, the public spoke about him, but not as the miracle worker, not as the king. They spoke about him with derision. With derision. I want to say too, when you read this text, John didn't just arbitrarily decide to drop this miracle in and say, I just don't want to be like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'll do something different. There's this very specific purpose in why he locates Jesus' first public demonstration of the kingdom having come and him being the king in a wedding. In a wedding. Because the wedding, you see, spoke of a breaking of the past and a starting of the new. When I drove my daughter to her wedding, I knew she wasn't coming back with me. She was going to be in the arms of another man. And she was going to build her new life. The moment she said, I do, and he said, I do, and we signed the legal document, it was done. I'm still her dad. She's still welcome in my home, but he comes with her. And now the grandchild that is on the way comes as well. So we're kind of being reduced more and more and more from kind of primary to third generation. It's a putting off of what used to be and a beginning of a whole new thing. And Jesus wants to send an example to all of us to say, we cannot build the kingdom if we're building it on old mindsets, old wineskins, old paradigms. There's got to be a putting off of it somewhere along the line. We can talk the talk, but until, as Louis said on Thursday night, until we get that revelation, we'll still be trying to build here, but on old methodologies. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in a wedding, the balance shifts from self-love to others' love. See, I can't love myself and pretend to be married to my wife and say that I love her, because if it's all about me and I'm just milking this relationship, how far do you think that's going to go? And Jesus was trying to contextualize for us that the nature of the kingdom was now going to be defined not as self-interest, not as self-love, but others-focused. I love what Eugene Peterson says about love and the way it's practiced. He says, worldly wisdom concedes that love is marvelous in the bedroom, but it is convinced that it has no place in government. It expects protestations of love on a beach in the moonlight, but finds them embarrassingly out of place around the conference table of a corporate boardroom. The problem is that nothing in all of biblical literature corroborates that contention. God is not only engaged in loving each person in a saving way, he is bringing a kingdom into being. And moreover, the whole of Scripture tells us that the same God who rules the world saves the soul. What is Peterson simply saying? Jesus deliberately launches his kingdom in John's mind in the context of a place of love, to say that I can do all of this kingdom stuff. I can get involved in all sorts of things for all the wrong reasons, when the only thing that motivates Jesus is love. Is love. Otherwise, it just works, you see. Otherwise, it's just acts. Otherwise, it's... And he's trying to say that the same form of love that is comfortable in the bedroom should be the same form of love for the people that sit around the boardroom with you on Monday morning when you're working out contracts, when you're working out projects, when you're working out all sorts of things. My last point, and I'll just mention this because I'm over time. Let me just say this. In Philippians chapter 2, In verse 19 to 22, Paul writes a horrific story. He writes to the Philippians and he says, there was a time that I wanted to send somebody to you to represent me, but I could find nobody because they were self-interested and they would have made capital out of this visit. They can't come with a pure heart. There are things that we start in terms of moving into the kingdom with a pure heart, and we end up sometimes in a place where it becomes about me. Jesus says, I'm anchoring it in the wedding feast to show you that the nature of the kingdom is about love. Love, love, love. Last point, and that's I'm gone. And that's the power of the single. This is the only reference to this particular miracle. Jesus doesn't use this miracle as the template for his ministry. He doesn't go back to that victory and say that proved that the kingdom had come. From now on, he would be doing it in all sorts of other areas and other contexts. But the power of the single says this to me. It's the power of the one-off. Jesus, at that moment, in that place, on that occasion, with those people, was present. And in that single moment, it counted for the kingdom. Didn't try and build a method. He didn't try and build a course. He didn't try and build a training course out of this kind of thing. All that God wanted him to do was in that moment, touch a young couple's life, shift them forever, and prove to those that would be his disciples, if I can do it here, I can do it anywhere. And then I can speak to businessmen, and then I can speak to boardrooms, and then I can speak to prophets, and then I can speak to school principals, and I can speak to educational authorities, and every time I go in, it's not because I'm harking back to the one victory that I had. I'm doing it because I'm listening. Whatever he says, do it. Here's my final thought. The thing that was most important about this story in John chapter 2, it's actually not the miracle. It's not the turning of water into wine. It's not the big thing. It was the presence of the King. God bless you.